All righty. Well, I think we should go ahead and get started. It's 4 o'clock on the dot. Um, so I want to welcome everybody to our follow-up discussion on resistance, reconciliation, and reform. This is a dialogue on policing and racial justice. I'm John Graham. I'll be your moderator this evening. I'm keynote speaker and a cultural competency educator. And tonight we'll be engaging in an open dialogue. Our previous conversation was all about the community expressing its concerns to law enforcement and giving law enforcement an opportunity to listen. In this dialogue, it's going to be a bit more open discussion back and forth, digging into some of the issues maybe that weren't covered, but also making sure that perspectives are heard. And we want to walk away from this engagement together tonight to achieve these three things. And first and foremost, we want to ensure that there's a mutual respect and a mutual understanding between law enforcement leaders and the community. Additionally, we want to ensure that the audience has a clear perspective on what law enforcement practices are and a better understanding of the people behind the badge, and vice versa. We also want law enforcement to get a better connection to some of the concerns and the people in the community. And then lastly, we want to make sure that the community's voice is heard and fully represented. And that does mean digging into some of the tough questions and the uncomfortable topics that are a requisite for growth as a community. So at this point, I want to allow the panel to introduce themselves. And I'll start with Dr. Pinkard. Dr. Pinkard, go ahead and introduce yourself.
All right. My name is Dr. Irene Pinkard, and I'm an educator by profession, having been in education over 35 years, working in the Oxnard Union High School District as a board member. I worked at LA Unified School District, the LA Community College District, and the Ventura Community College District when I retired in 2003. Currently, I am working as the executive director for the Pinkard Youth Institute. I'm a former board member, as I said, for Oxnard Union High School District, a former council member from the Oxnard City Council and former mayor pro tem. And I'm on the executive committee of the NAACP, and I attend Bethel AME Church, and I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Just for a few things, but very active in the community as a youth advocate.
Fantastic. Yeah. It's a pleasure to have you this evening.
All right.
Rabia Rahman, please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you for having me. And putting me behind such an esteemed pedigree, Dr. Pinkard. My name is Rabia. I go by Rabia, and I'm an attorney in Ventura County, and I recently started my own firm. I practice employment law, representing employees in discrimination, harassment, unpaid wages cases. I am also the vice president of Black Lawyers of Ventura County, and I am the vice chair of the Social Justice Fund for Ventura County.
Excellent. Pleasure to have you, Rabia. Sheriff Ayub, if you don't mind.
Oh, happy to. Thank you for having me here this afternoon with this esteemed group. My name is Bill Ayub. I am the 20th elected sheriff of Ventura County. Lifelong resident of Ventura County, born and raised in Ventura. Left for a few years to be a police officer in Las Vegas in the early 1990s. Almost 35 years in the public safety profession. It's sometimes called law enforcement, but that's just a small part of what we do. So I prefer to call it the public safety profession. Worked in a variety of places. I worked in Santa Paula to start, and then in Port Hueneme, North Las Vegas for several years. And then I came back to the sheriff's office in 1996. And I was elected sheriff in 2018. I worked every position within the sheriff's office, from deputy sheriff through assistant sheriff, which is an appointed executive position with the agency. And for perspective, the sheriff's office provides policing services in the unincorporated parts of the county, and then also in cities that pay the sheriff's office to be its police force. We have 5 of the 10 cities in Ventura County where we are the police force: in Ojai, Fillmore, Moore Park, Camarillo, and Thousand Oaks. But we do so much more than that. We staff the jails in Ventura County. The bailiffs in the courtrooms are deputy sheriffs of the Ventura County Sheriff's Office. We have a regional crime lab, a training academy, search and rescue program, a civil process unit, and many more functions that most people don't know the Sheriff's Office does. So delighted to be here today, and hope we have a terrific dialogue that leads to, as you said, some much needed growth in our community. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Sheriff. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Nick Odenath, please introduce yourself.
Yes, well, thank you all for having me. I appreciate it. Just a little bit of background on myself. So I have been in law enforcement for a little over 19 years. For the past year, I've been the president of the Ventura County Deputy Sheriff's Association. Prior to that, I served as director on the Ventura County Deputy Sheriff's Association board. And I am a transplant to Ventura County. I originally grew up in Orange County, came here and attended California Lutheran University with a degree in psychology, and then worked for a few years at Pacifica in Camarillo as a child care counselor prior to joining the sheriff's office. In my career with the sheriff's office, I've worked in a number of different assignments, including detention services, our patrol division, specifically in the city of Thousand Oaks. I've worked in our court division, and then as a detective in narcotics, and most recently in human trafficking. And then I recently promoted to sergeant, and I'm now back in detention services.
It's quite a career. I must say, this panel, I don't know where you all find time to do things like this, as busy as you are. So excellent. Thank you, Nick. Let's just jump right in. In our last session, we received a few questions from one of our panelists, Nicole Lopez Gonzalez. And there was a sense that you didn't have enough time, Nick, to address those questions. So I wanted to first start by opening the floor to give you an opportunity to respond to some of the points that Nicole brought up.
Yeah, well, first, thank you, John, for giving me the time to address these issues.
Sure.
So what I'd like to do is I do have a written statement, because I want to make sure that we address each of the questions as much as I can. So one of the questions that was brought up is in regards to Senate Bill 1421. And so I wanted to give those listening and watching just a little bit of background on the bill, and then kind of describe our stance on it. So Senate Bill 1421 is also known as the California Public Records Act, and it amended California Penal Code 832.7. And really, in summary, this bill in its amendment would allow for the release of records to the public in certain instances involving peace officers in California. Those incidents include the discharge of a firearm, or when peace officers use force against someone that results in death or serious bodily injury. And then any records related to an incident which has sustained by law enforcement, or which was sustained by law enforcement or oversight agency, that a peace officer engaged in sexual assault by a member of the public. And in defining the sexual assault in this particular bill, it's a little bit broader definition than is described in the Criminal Penal Code. And includes the initiation or attempt to initiation of a sexual act by a peace officer by force under the color of authority. And even at a peace officer proposal to a member of the public to commit a sexual act is considered sexual assault under the definition. Now, any records related to a sustained finding of peace officers' dishonesty in reporting, investigation, or prosecution of a crime, or the misconduct of a person or another peace officer. Now, with sexual assault and the dishonesty subsections of this bill, that allows for due process. And in other words, that means that they allow for an investigation to be conducted and determine if there's an allegation to be found to be true. However, and this is really the concern from the association, is in incidences involving use of force, there's no allowance for due process in the current drafting of the bill that became law. The California Penal Code only gives an agency 180 days from the time of use of force to comply with records of release. And use of force investigations, which involve the discharge of a firearm or serious bodily injury, can take quite a long time to investigate, well beyond the 180 days. Our concern is that this creates a window in which information is released to the public prior to due process of a peace officer being complete. It allows for prejudgment regarding the use of force incident without understanding all the facts related to the incident. It can also create a situation that could jeopardize the investigation itself by putting out information that may charge a witness or create perception issues related to the event. The bottom line is that justice oftentimes is not instantaneous. It takes a long time, especially with these types of investigations, because these types of investigations are typically very in-depth. My concern is twofold, in that it would create an undue stress on peace officers who may ultimately have acted within the scope of the law in their use of force. And we've seen examples of this play out in our nation, in which peace officers and their families have received death threats or been publicly shamed by members of the public without knowing all the facts, and only later being cleared of the alleged misuse of force after the investigation is complete. And we've seen examples of peace officers who have also had to relocate as a result of information being released early to the public when ultimately they were cleared after the fact. My second concern relates to the community. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who does not want to see riots and destruction in our community. I'm concerned that the release of the records regarding the use of force prior to a complete investigation and resolution would potentially open the door to increased violence, riots, and possible destruction, much like what we've seen in other parts of the nation. That only creates further division and prevents community growth, which is why we're here today. As the saying goes, you can't unring the bell. However, it was later proven that the incident may have been totally justified. The release of these records may cause some of this riot and destruction prior to that information coming out. I think the one final consideration, specifically as it relates to 1421, is to think about some of the victim families. The release of this information could have some significant impacts on family members related to the person who was shot or seriously injured. And it also could affect families of victims who were seriously harmed by a perpetrator prior to use of force being used against the perpetrator, whether it be a mass casualty situation like we've seen throughout the nation. The release of the records of these families could be extremely painful and harmful, and could create some issues with them if released to the public. Now, in regards to Assembly Bill 392, which is also known as the Peace Officers Use of Force Bill, this California Penal Code amended 196 and 835A. Now, the Ventura County Deputy Sheriff's Association did initially oppose Assembly Bill 392 during its first draft. The original language, we believed, was a violation of the United States Constitution. The first draft eliminated the reasonable officer standard and ability for peace officers to exercise self-defense if confronted by an act of violence. So in essence, in the original draft, peace officers would be required to exercise all de-escalation tactics, including retreating, prior to use of deadly force when encountered by someone who was using force that would likely cause death to the peace officer or even a member of the public. One example is if confronted by a person who is advancing on an officer with a knife, if they were to go through all the less lethal options, they may not survive that incident. and additionally, that offender would still be a danger to the public. It is in everyone's safety that police policy states that they can go to the level of force necessary to overcome the force being used on them or another. And it would have peace officers in a situation where they simply would not be able to protect members of the public or themselves, and would undermine the basic principles of protecting the public. So in that original draft, we actually worked very closely with our state representatives to explain our concerns. We did work collaboratively to find language that would allow peace officers the ability to protect the community. If the law had passed as originally written, peace officers would have been left with less of a right of self-defense than even civilians. Yet they're asked to make split-second decisions and often life or death decisions in order to maintain safety in the community. Now, ultimately, the bill was amended and aligned with existing federal language regarding use of force. And to be clear, we completely supported the amended version of 392. We additionally asked for training related to use of force, which came in the form of Senate Bill 230, which also was included as a companion bill with 392. And really, this is just an example of us constantly asking and requesting for continued training for peace officers, because ultimately that's our job, is to advocate for peace officers for better training to protect our communities. The other question that was brought up in the last session was, would I advocate Sheriff Civilian Oversight Commission? I think the simply to have the oversight committee, I don't see the need for it at this point. And the reason why, as the president of the Ventura County Deputy Sheriff's Association, I can say that I routinely work with the sheriff and his administrators. They have always been absolutely transparent with me and with our staff. I would contend our community has one of the most professional law enforcement organizations in the nation, and I don't say that lightly. The sheriff's office has been quick to address potential problems that arise. The sheriff and his office have always had an open door policy to invite community members to engage in communication. And I encourage members of the community to actively engage with the sheriff's office and participate in the programs that are offered, including the Citizens Academy, the Ride Along program, and meeting with the chiefs of police in the respective contract cities. Of course, after COVID-19 is passed. The other question that was addressed in the last, or asked in the last session, was why does the sheriff not hire for more diversity? All I can give you is my perspective. Based on those who applied for the department, I would say that sheriff's office has done a really good job. I know the sheriff is constantly working on attracting the most professional and dedicated community members that are interested in this profession. Another question that was asked is, why do we have Hollow Point Firearms as a business supporter? I can tell you that Hollow Point is a reputable firearms dealer in the county. They only sell lawful firearms, and the VCDSA is proud to have them as a sponsor. And then the other remaining questions were related to SRO, specifically for the Oxnard Union High School District. Because that's not part of sheriff's jurisdiction, we don't have jurisdiction over the city of Oxnard or the school district. And therefore we don't have members in that city. So I can't speak directly to the circumstances that were brought up, but I would recommend reaching out to Oxnard Police Department regarding those questions. And then the final question was related to why does Pacifica High School have only one resource counselor, yet there are a number of school resource officers? Again, that's in the city of Oxnard. And, again, I would recommend reaching out to the Oxnard Police Department regarding those questions. So I appreciate, again, the time, John, to go ahead and answer those questions, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you for that. So before we move on, I just want to open it up for Dr. Pinkert or Rabia to respond to any of those points. If there's anything of note that Nick's remarks
Uh,
that you'd like to address.
I do, but if Dr. Pinkert has any thoughts, I would definitely.
No, go ahead, Rabia. I'll come after you.
Okay, thank you. Just before I jump in, I wanted to ask Sheriff Ayub if he also wanted to perhaps address some of these questions. I think the one about diversity hiring might fall also under your jurisdiction. So if you had any thoughts that you wanted to, bring to light, before I, jump in, because I was taking notes, Nick, and I do have some initial reactions. So I want to go through them. So if Sheriff Ayub wants to go first.
Sure, I'm happy to address that. We certainly value a diverse organization. We understand the connectivity that gives us organizationally to the communities we serve. We quite frankly struggle in this regard. We quite frankly struggle entirely in finding high quality deputy sheriff candidates that want to come into the profession. And in difficult times like these, this is something that gives me a lot of heartburn, because one thing I want to do before I leave this profession is to make sure that it is in good shape and sustained for the future. And that has to include the ability to attract and retain highly skilled, dedicated men and women that want to serve this community as peace officers. And it's not an attractive profession at the moment. And I've seen it ebb and flow over the years. And I hope for brighter days ahead, without question. But we operate within the bounds of civil service regulations. We do really go after women deputy sheriffs in particular. We run a women's jail, and we have to have female deputy sheriffs. But we also appeal or try to appeal to minority communities. We have a lot of branded material that features deputy sheriffs that are considered minorities. We go out into the communities at colleges, and we look for virtually any candidate that's willing to come and give law enforcement, public safety service in Ventura County a try. And we are challenged to find diverse applicants, but we do a reasonable job at that. We could certainly do better, and I hope that we do in the future. And in the same vein, we look to have diversity at all levels within the organization. And we're challenged in some cases to find employees that want to take on leadership roles. And so as you look at the different layers of leadership within the organization, they're not necessarily representative of our community. And I'd like them to be. I'd like to find people that want to take on leadership and want to serve at a higher level. And there's a misperception that everybody wants to be the sheriff, and it couldn't be farther from the truth. There's just a lot of people that want to do the frontline work, and that's okay. But it does complicate our challenges with increasing diversity within the organization.
And Sheriff Ayub, if I can, on that point, do you feel that it's would you say it's because there's a lack of diverse representation in the county, or is it more so an indication of the attraction efforts of the department, right? As far as why you aren't seeing the talent coming through.
Right. We look at the diversity, at least according to census polls of the county, and then we take our employees and we look at a percentage of ethnic racial makeup in our workforce, and then we compare those numbers and look for fair representation across the spectrum. And
looks like we may have lost Sheriff Ayub. Well, Rabia, let me kick it back over to you until we get. Oh, Sheriff, it looks like we lost you for just a bit. It looks like you're back now. Please continue.
I'm not sure where I left off. I think we were talking about
the demographic data you had mentioned.
The demographic data. We look at our census data within our county. And of course, we're a county-wide organization, so we look at the county-wide demographics, and
Sure.
And we do come up short in some categories, and it's something we would like to improve upon, but we struggle with that, and
right.
but it is certainly a goal.
Excellent, Rabia.
Sure. So I thank you, Nick, for preparing your response to those questions. I think that, they were, valid questions that the community really wanted to hear the answers to. But I want to start off my response with the concept around language, right? And being thoughtful in how you communicate sometimes points, right? And so one thing that, kind of struck me personally was the categorization of what's happening around the country as riots and destruction. I think there are really valid concerns and valid upset that if we minimize or diminish the value of that harm that people are truly experiencing, you are, you're casting out their valid concerns. And so as you categorize what we're seeing, in our collective consciousness right now as riots and destruction, it's not only is it hurtful, but it's just kind of, it's a very narrow focus lens. And I invite you to kind of be more thoughtful about how you perhaps communicate, the specific point that you're trying to get across. I think there is some room for, being critical, right, and holding a critical lens to some things that you might not agree with, but I was struck when you said on a few occasions the concept of riots and destruction is what we're seeing, and that's not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing are people fighting for their liberation, and so I wanted to just make that point first.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And so this two, I mean, I have a lot, and so I don't know if we want to go back and forth and answer. So the next thought was about the oversight. I'm just kind of going to go backwards. And maybe oversight is not the right word. Perhaps we can kind of, develop a more common language or understanding on what the community is looking for and what people are looking for in their relationship with law enforcement. Perhaps, police community partnerships or a police and community understanding or collaboration to make sure that it is truly a safe community for all of its members. And so, and I understand that perhaps from an internal lens, you don't see it as being, problematic or see any problems. And I didn't come here with a list of grievances to tell you well, these are problems. But I want to address the kind of concept of it's difficult to not acknowledge that we are a highly racialized nation or highly racialized society in general, based on our founding and our failure to really reckon with that history, and to kind of assert perhaps that that there's some level of that it hasn't seeped in to members of law enforcement in some way, when we have so many subjective standards that apply to law enforcement in any place of employment or any workplace or any element of society, that when there's a subjective element, you are also you are relying on your subconscious, your implicit, biases or your conditioning, right? And so so the idea of a police community partnership, or, for lack of a better word, oversight, but if that's not what, we're actually looking for, I don't know if there's another way to perhaps, another word to use. I think we can't just say because there's not a glaring problem, because we don't have a Derek Chauvin in Ventura County, that there isn't a problem. And I think that there's an opportunity and a call for all of us to look inward and see how that collective conditioning is showing up in us, in our daily lives, and in our workplaces. And then another thing about the reasonable standard. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Robbie, if I can just drill into that point really quick before we move forward. So you're bringing up a very good point around unconscious bias, right? And the effects of socialization on how we engage each other. In this case, from a law enforcement and community relationship perspective. And I hear a question in there, and really I think it's one to be thrown out and dig into is, what are we doing to address the unconscious biases of our law enforcement, and addressing when those unconscious biases are acted upon in the line of duty, right? So I'll throw that out there and get your guys' perspective, because it's been a conversation, I think, nationally and internationally, as it were, around addressing unconscious bias, not only in the workplace, but also right, in the line of work. So I'll throw that out there, gentlemen. What are your thoughts on addressing unconscious biases, within the process, not only in training, but also in continuous training and addressing issues once they arise?
That's for either Nick or myself?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll take that. I'm happy to. I think it's a very significant point of consideration. It is something we look for when we hire employees to be deputy sheriffs and professional staff employees within our agency. I know there's some legislative efforts afoot in Sacramento to mandate posts to make it a point of consideration for hiring across the state. But it is something we have done here, and we include as part of our psychological exam, entrance exam for new employees. But I think it is also important that we continue to look for those biases, especially the implicit bias, right? I mean, because that can creep out and manifest itself as explicit bias at any time in somebody's profession. I've seen people who are outstanding police officers or deputy sheriffs when they're young in their career, and then as they go through life, they have events that happen. Perhaps the job turns them, or they have a seminal event in their life, a divorce or the loss of a child or something that changes them. And then their outward behavior then changes. And perhaps there was an implicit bias in there that we may not have recognized that manifests later in a career. I do think it's important that we look for those things throughout the career as people progress through their careers with law enforcement. Something we're looking at right now.
Are there reevaluation checkpoints along the path, annually, quarterly, where you can assess these impacts?
There's really not. It's done through a supervision process. We encourage active supervision by our supervisors throughout the agency to look for signs of the manifestations of stress. They can be brought on by critical incidents. The tough profession, you see things that human beings just shouldn't have to see over and over again, year after year, and it can change people. But we do have a bias-based policing policy that we require employees to review every year. We have various training modules that are required to review that include bias and discrimination, cultural sensitivity, harassment, and those types of things. Every other year, every 5 years in some case. So it's almost annually we do something along the lines of checking biases with our employees. We are looking at a program of micro learning modules that are pretty interesting to me, and I think we'll see some more opportunities for us to get a good look at our employees and to allow them to get a good look at themselves as well.
Got it. Dr. Pinkard. Yeah, Dr. Pinkard, I was just going to come on.
Thank you. Let me first say that I have police officers, law enforcement in my family. So I'm very concerned and astute as to what kinds of things they go through. When we talk about the supervisors being the ones who check the bias of another police officers, none of them look like the people they've committed the offense against. And so they aren't going to have the same kind of concern or see what we see. So when you talk about the supervisors being the one to check them, I don't see them coming up with the same kind of instruction and training for those officers that someone who looks like me would bring to that table. I know that my brother was a sergeant in San Bernardino, and he came into the room, and one of the officers were messing around and they said the N-word, and then they looked at him and said, "Oh, Sarge, I didn't mean it. It wasn't meant for you." And he said, "No, it's okay, because you're showing me what you're really like. It's not about it wasn't meant. It's you're saying what normally comes to mind when you talk about people who look like me." So when we talk about having some implicit bias training, it should be continuous. And looking for the bias as you hire somebody is not the same as training for implicit bias while they're in service, because it's always easy to look like you are ready for the job and you don't have those implicit bias tendencies as you get hired. But what happens is those individuals get hired and they promote the same thing for the new hires that come in. And when they become the trainers, they will blank out the people who look like me that come in, because they're a lot harder on them when they're in training. So their implicit bias is shown by the way they treat that trainee. That's something that I would like you to think about when you talk about the implicit bias and you do something every other year or something. That I think implicit bias is something that needs to be continuous, not only for them, but for us. We all have implicit biases. So I'm not just picking on the police. All of us need to rethink where we're coming from for sometimes. I know that Rabia mentioned to Nick about watching kind of the words that one says, like violence. And that's something that I wrote down, because when you say the violence around the country, it's like anything that is beyond what the law enforcement think is correct is violence. And that's not what these individuals are out there doing. A lot of those people who are committing violence are damaged, are people who do it all the time. And the people who are protesting are not even a part of that. So I hate to see them all lumped into the same group. So that's hurtful when we talk about the violence. This is why we do it, because of the violence. Because I don't consider myself a violent person, but I would be out there too if I was of the age that they would allow me to get out of this house to do the marches. But I think sometimes we have to watch that. And then when we talk about highly qualified, educated, to me that hit a chord, meaning, is that saying that people, is that a key word, highly high quality educated? Is that counting me out or someone who looks like me out? Because sometimes those are trigger words for those of us who are Black to say, that's to say that I'm not, because we're not considered to be highly qualified, highly educated, and that's not the case. And I would like to say that if you're looking for individuals who are going to be law enforcement, sometimes you need to come to people who look like me, go to historically Black colleges and universities, ask me where you can find some candidates, asked me to help you find some candidates, because you can't keep going in your same circles because you get the same results. So there are plenty of us who would be very willing to help and assist. And when we talk about not having the people, the community be involved with the investigations because of the fact that the public doesn't know all the ins and outs or all the implications for whatever is going on. I think what we're looking for is a citizens review board. And we don't, when you have officers investigating officers, the public isn't going to be satisfied with what comes out of that. I'm sorry. It's just not going to happen. It's like me investigating my son and then telling you what the results are. Who's going to believe that if it's not open and transparent? And that's all a citizens review board is about. Not to castigate or downplay what an officer does or the professionalism they have, because I know them personally and I know how professional they are, but there are some that aren't. So by having a review board, it gives the public some opportunity to know that this is a legitimate investigation. This is what happened. They are doing their best to make sure we are protected, because we want to feel protected and serve just like anybody else in the community. And we need to understand what happens during those investigations.
Dr. Pinker, thank you for that. I think you touched on a couple of things, and one specifically was around the culture of law enforcement, right? And even within the departments, this similarity bias that plays out when you're hiring or when you're recruiting, and that comes from people hiring for like and very similar beliefs, backgrounds, community upbringings, and so forth. So I think there's a real question there of how are you creating a culture not only of inclusion for people that are already in the department, but how are you, what kind of guardrails or structural mechanisms are you putting in place to ensure that there is accountability for when it goes off the rails, for when those processes aren't adhered to, that give more opportunities or I guess more consideration to expanding diversity within your departments or your organizations? That's a law enforcement question.
I gathered that. I'll try and take that one if I understand it correctly.
No worries.
And when I mentioned earlier, if I said educated, I didn't necessarily mean that per se. But when I talk about a highly qualified employee, I'm talking about somebody who's got a history of making good decisions, somebody who's avoided criminal behavior, who is a likely candidate to fulfill a career with us, somebody who's got some maturity under their belt. We value military service. In fact, we go to our local Navy base and look for employees from the ranks of those getting ready to retire. Unfortunately, many want to go back home. A lot of them are from other parts of the country, and many don't stay. They don't want to for some reason. But
if I can make a point on that, there's been studies that showcase a direct transition from military into local law enforcement doesn't necessarily have the best outcomes for communities, right? The training is very different when you think about policing on a military level, especially in a foreign conflict or foreign environment. Those policing tactics coming back into a local community are part of the problem that we're trying to address today, right? The militarized or over policed or overly aggressive policing outcomes. So I just wanted to throw that out there because maybe there's an opportunity, and I think Dr. Pinker mentioned, the relationship between historically Black colleges and universities and providing exposure to law enforcement opportunities as well could be a very good pathway. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great idea, and I'd like to explore that further with Dr. Pinkard when we're offline a little bit.
Okay.
Excellent.
That's certainly a consideration. I mentioned that we specifically go after females because of our we have a high attrition rate with female deputies that come aboard with our agency, but we have to have them, and they make great police officers, deputy sheriffs for our community. And we've gone to female youth or female athletic programs at colleges, and not that college experience is necessarily a prerequisite for policing, but we do find a level of maturity and level of dedication and discipline that comes with those that work their way through a college environment. We do find that valuable as for our deputy sheriffs in the community. But
Sure.
Our process is blind in essence. We have a written exam that's administered. It's a post as being the commission, state commission on police officer standards and training that is provided to interested candidates, and it's graded in the blind. We have no idea whose test sheets are looked at, and then those that proceed through the process are welcomed into the agency if they can get through polygraph examinations, medical examinations, a battery of tests that are given to look for suitable candidates for the profession. So we work really hard to try and find the right people to police the community. At the end, regardless of policy laws that are in place, it's the heart and mind of the people that are policing our community that makes the difference.
Yeah,
and that's what we really look for.
Where do you think it falls short? Right? If it were perfect, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. But where do you think it falls short before it gets to a use of force incident or an issue where a community member is profiled, or before the act happens? Where do you think we fall short within the department from recognizing these racial disparities just within the culture? Is it more so not being called out when it's seen? Is it sort of the a culture of silence or protection? What would you guys think it is, if you could put a finger on it? And Nick, that's for you as well.
For me, from my perspective, there is a challenge. I'm in charge and responsible for everybody, all 1,300-ish employees or so of the department. I have no idea what a deputy in Ojai is doing right now, or in Fillmore, or in Oak Park, or in one of the jails.
Sure.
We rely heavily on personal accountability. Our employees have a lot of independence. They're in dark alleys and remote areas. We have 2 deputies in Lockwood Valley that patrol 650 square miles, and so there's not a lot of oversight there. And the ability for me to identify somebody who is not doing things the right way is very difficult. And I rely heavily on supervisors and managers around the agency, but also on the public. We welcome feedback from the public on bad behavior. It's very easy to file a complaint against a deputy sheriff. You can pull a form off the internet, off our smartphone application. Any call to a station can trigger a complaint process investigation. So we really rely on reports from the public of bad behavior and misconduct. We take them very seriously. We have a unit within the agency that's dedicated to investigating any such complaints, and we take action every year in multiple cases of employee misconduct, and most are generated internally by other employees blowing the whistle, if you will, or bringing the attention of supervision management to whatever the misconduct is.
Gotcha. Dr. Pinkard, I want to give you, I want to sort of shift a little bit. And one of the things that I think we wanted to come out of this was bridging the gap between the community understanding of law enforcement, also law enforcement understanding the community.
Yes.
And I wanted to, if you could talk about some of the things where you think, there's an opportunity for better understanding about Black or Brown communities that would be helpful to law enforcement understand and better execute their jobs.
Okay. One of the things, and I want to thank the sheriff for clarifying educated and highly qualified, because those other adjectives really helped me to understand what you were meaning. They're less offensive. But one of the bridges that I think can happen, we always have a ride along with the sheriffs, and like Nick said, right now you can't do that because of COVID. But I would invite you or challenge you to ride along with me or somebody else in the community without your badge, without a tie, without your uniform, an everyday citizens, and see some of the things that take place to see how things happen in the community. Like you said, you don't know where all of these 1,300 or plus people are, and they're in dark alleys, things happen. And that's true, you wouldn't know. But if you rode along with me, you would see some of what happens, and it would be very different than the report that you may get from the individual who's committed the offense to the person. I know that I raised my son, who is now over 40, but he was let out of school in high school because it was prom. And so he was driving down the street to get go get his tuxedo. I happened to come home early that day. I don't know why. But as I passed by getting back on the freeway to go to my job at Harbor College, I saw him pulled over by a sheriff. And I stopped, and I'm thinking, well, what did he do? And the sheriff said, well, he's out of school and he should have a note. Well, what mother, what parent would know, if you got permission from the school that he could be out of school with your permission, that he should be carrying a note? But what was even more telling is that they let him drive off without a note. So sometimes I wonder about the things that they say. I sent him to the store a couple of years later, and he didn't come home for about 3 hours just to go to the store, which was around the corner. And I called a friend of mine to help me find him, and we finally decided we need to call the police department. It turns out that they had picked him up again, and this time it was because they stopped him and they searched the car, which is something that doesn't always happen to everybody else. And they found nunchucks. He was in a karate class and they had nunchucks. So they took him in because he had what they called a weapon, but it was something he had in class. So those are the kinds of things that I think we could bridge the gap by talking to parents about what kinds of things would be suspect or cause problems, and riding along with some of us to see what happens at night, so they can't see who's in the car, to see who gets stopped and why. Because stopping me for a broken tail light and then having everybody sit on the curb and search the whole car is more like profiling to me than it is checking to tell someone they have a broken tail light. But I think there are also meetings you can have with community groups. My church would be glad to have the sheriff come in and talk to them about things that are a problem. One of the good things we have here with Chief Whitney is he has a real good connection to various leaders in the Black community. And he talked to them about what things are happening and how can we do better, and what can our police officers do to help you in your area. I think there should be more of that. If we had those kinds of meetings, even if they're once every 3 months, to find out what is going on, what kinds of things are causing problems for you to distrust us as your servant protector, or to protect and serve. Because quite frankly, at this point, I wouldn't call a policeman to protect me, because it usually turns out badly when you called a sheriff or a police. Now, I would do it here in Oxnard because I know most of them, but I don't know about anywhere else. And I think that's some of what needs to happen, is to get to know the community more intimately. We have no problems discussing some of the issues that we have, showing you some of the things that have happened. And when someone is told to file a complaint, usually if a complaint never goes anywhere for us, it's put in a circular file and we never know about it or what happened, and the officer goes on his merry way. But there needs to be a way of knowing what happens with those complaints as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have a specific place where those types of complaints go when it's associated with racial profiling, or whether it's use of force? Is it handled differently, or is it sort of plugged into a general complaint stream?
We with the Sheriff's Office have a bureau that we call our Professional Standards Bureau, Internal Affairs, that investigates all citizen complaints. And the complainant is notified of the results of the investigation once the investigation is complete. And the investigations are protected by law. At least many of the details. You heard Nick speak to SB 1421, which would release some of those details to the public. And there's legislation afoot that would expand the release of information in police complaint cases to the public. But the complaints are categorized. We published in the form of a press statement and on our public-facing website our statistics for our citizen complaints. It includes the types of complaints, the dispositions of those complaints, and that's available at venturasheriff.org.
What is that again?
venturasheriff.org,
Okay.
O-R-G.
All right.
Rabia,
I've never looked.
Okay, I'm certainly going to check myself. Thank you for that, Sheriff. Rabia, I wanted to circle back to you. I know you had a few more things that you wanted to address. Let's dig in.
Oh, regarding Nick's comments up front?
I mean, wherever we are.
For now, Nick, I'll come back to you offline. So a couple of things. Listening to Dr. Pinker talk, I love that idea of the kind of reverse ride along to connect like the human element. I think that often is missing because of just the way we're socialized. We don't have those intimate human connections. I think that is definitely something like what is like you can't hate up close, right? And so to the extent that we can connect on a more human level and those interpersonal relationships, I think that will challenge any implicit biases as they arise within you. No, so I wanted, because this forum is talking about race, I think it is perhaps appropriate to actually talk about race. Just as, just on a personal note, if you cannot tell from my fair skin and the fact that I'm the vice president of Black Lawyers of Ventura County, I am clearly mixed race. Growing up in the United States as a mixed race individual, you are confronted with it on a regular basis, and you have to experience early on varying degrees of acceptance, rejection, and feelings of belonging and not belonging. And so race has been a constant in my life and has contributed significantly to my own personal identity development. And so I wanted to ask, Sheriff Ayub and Nick, if you have ever confronted the notion of your whiteness and what whiteness in America means to you, and if it has contributed at all to your own personal identity development.
I'll go first. Get this light out
Sure.
of my eyes first. Well, first I want to say, Dr. Pinkard and Rabia, I appreciate and respect your response to my comments, and I would appreciate the talk offline at any point. In regards to, I recently actually took a class talking about, was really focused on privilege, which is a key word. I think that, especially in the political climate that we live in, can be a triggering word for some. And the class really kind of demystified it for me, which I thought was really good in kind of my growth and learning experience. I think it's something that we don't get training on. It's not something that's taught in schools.
Right.
And so we talked about implicit bias. I think those things go hand in hand when we talk about growth and development. And so just recognizing that because the color of my skin, there's certain hurdles that I won't experience. And that doesn't mean that my life has been easy. It doesn't mean that I haven't worked hard to get where I'm at, but the color of my skin has not been a hurdle in that journey. So just educating myself, as these issues come up and learning to grow and understand has kind of helped me better understand. And obviously I continually need growing and learning as we go, and we all do, right? But at least for me, that's maybe one little nugget of insight that I've pulled from it. I hope that answers your question, at least for me personally.
I appreciate you sharing your perspective, Nick, and I think it's admirable that you are taking the opportunity to educate yourself about race and its implications or contexts, especially from positions of privilege. The key is, once you've learned about it, right, and you've put some time towards education and commitment to awareness, it's how do you leverage that privilege to empower and to create equitable outcomes, right, for those that you engage with. And then also encouraging those in your organization, in your circle and community and so forth to do similar education endeavors. So I appreciate you sharing that. I think from a race perspective, and this is sort of an all play, confronting the underlying realities that race play in our daily lives creates now a question, right? You're in law enforcement. We in the community have to deal with race on a daily basis, and so when you add that layer to our interactions between law enforcement and when we do engage in the community, we're going to see these outcomes or these engagements very differently, just based on being Black in America or being brown in America. The question is, how do we now, you heard Matt Bowden talk about the talk. I would be interested to understand, what kind of talk do you guys have when it comes to law enforcement and your children, or around race? And how do you have that talk? I think since George Floyd was lynched in May, there's been a lot of conversations that have needed to be had. I would love to understand, just from a personal perspective, how have you engaged your families or your communities around race and race relations?
So I'll weigh in on that. I have three children, and my baby's 24, almost 24.
Mm-hmm.
And we had, of course, conversations about the police, and being a police, career, lifelong police officer. I certainly know the perspective from being behind the badge. And I've been, when I was younger, I was stopped by the police, and I felt like I was harassed and some other things too. I'm certainly not because of the color of my skin. I've never had that feeling of disadvantage. But our conversations went more like, hey, you don't argue at the street at the street with the officer. You have no idea why they're stopping you, what they think they know about you. They don't know you're a good guy or somebody who intends them harm. You just, keep your hands where they can see them. Don't do anything dumb, and don't argue, because they're human beings. And if you tick them off, they're more likely to take some kind of action against you. And that was really the nature of it. Our conversations never revolved around race. It hasn't been a topic of conversation in our household, because it wasn't important to highlight differences. We just that's not the way our family. That's not the way we've raised our children. It's just hasn't been a topic of conversation in that way. Certainly, conversations are taking place now with the highlighting of incidents of bad police behavior and historical mistreatment of the Black communities by law enforcement over decades. And we've had conversations about that and about, you know, the type of policing that I expect our agency, Ventura County Sheriff's Office, to engage in, and how anything related to the infusion of race in the way we do our business is just unacceptable. We should be blind in the community. We are here to keep the community safe, to engender trust, and to bring violators to justice, whoever those violators may be. And it sounds kind of simplistic, I know.
Well, no, I appreciate your transparency there, Sheriff Ayub. And Dr. Pinkert, on one of those points, I'm hearing the notion of color blindness, and I wanted to throw that to you. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you respond to that?
I don't believe in color blindness. I'm sorry, because I can be walking down the street 2 blocks and you know who I am, and you know right away that's a Black woman, and you think that, period, because it's your implicit bias. So whether it's color blindness you want to call it, but I used to think that was possible, but I just don't think it's possible for people to be totally colorblind. You know, they see your ethnicity because it's obvious who you are. It's not something you can hide or cover. So there is no color blindness when it comes, oh, that's a Black person, period. And so it may be a nice way to put it, to say color blindness, but as a person of color, I don't see that as a possibility. When someone sees me, they see who I am, and I can't hide that. There's no, you know, and I don't care to hide it. But for a police officer, he's the officer that may stop someone, that's the first thing they're going to see. And they seem to get their antennas up and place their hands on their gun before they even get to your window to even tell you what the problem is. And I'll say that when they went to arrest, I think his name was Wolf, who had killed the 9 people in the church at Emmanuel. It was interesting to note that none of them put their hand on their gun. And this is a guy who already shot 9 people and they know he's dangerous. But no officer pulled their gun or had their hands on the gun. In fact, they took him to have something to eat. So when you talk about color blindness, it doesn't work for me because that's the kind of thing that the community sees. And so I was going to ask you and Nick, the sheriff, can you see why when people of color are stopped, they're afraid of the police instead of thinking they're stopping them to help them? From the things that are being said and the things that you've seen, can you see why some of us would be anxious and afraid when you pull up behind us with the light?
Well, I can absolutely see that point. There's no question. And again, even looking at our history in law enforcement and policing, some of the redlining history that we've got in our nation, where law enforcement was enforcing those laws.
Right.
So it certainly, especially from a historical perspective, I can certainly understand why there's still the talk today when a law enforcement officer turns on the lights behind you and you're driving down the street, and why there's concern when they see a law enforcement officer drive by them about what's going to happen next. So I do understand that part of it. Yes.
Good. Good. And
So-
that,
Oh,
I
please continue.
just wanted to point that out because maybe it'll help you better to communicate and have dialogue with the community, knowing the history and why they're so distrustful sometimes about police stopping them. And I respect police. They have a hard job. It's not one that is considered a premium job, just like teaching isn't considered a premium job all the time. It's a hard job. It takes a lot of forethought. You're asked to make quick second decisions. And if you make the wrong one, it could cost you. So I do understand that, but I think we all need to understand each other to make the communication between us and the cooperation between the communities better. And that's all that the NAACP is wanting, and that's all that I want as an individual in this community, because just like we have been saying, we're tired of dying. Period.
Yeah.
John, before we move on, I wanted
Please.
to go back to something that Sheriff Ayub said, and I was hoping that he would be able to elaborate, because it kind of like struck me. And so he said that he doesn't, encourage, like, or not encourage, but like they don't think about or talk about the concept of race either in the workplace or in the home, because
Sure.
it's divisive. And so I invite you to elaborate on that concept, and also what are the conversations that you're having on, like, about humanity in general, that's inclusive, if the opposite to talk about race is divisive.
I don't recall saying that talking about race is divisive necessarily. I think it's important that we conduct ourselves and police our communities with equity, and that's treating all with the same steady hand, with the same specter of fairness. And we certainly see people's skin tone and recognize their ethnicity, their race. That goes without question. What I expect that we don't do is treat people differently because of that. And I understand there's different cultural expectations or understandings. Like Nick, I was a psychology major. I took a class called ethnopsychology in college, and it was the understanding of how different cultures think, psychological perceptions for different cultures. And ever since then, and I've craved the understanding of other people and how they view situations and scenarios. And to me, it's interesting, and it's just all part of the complexity of our society. But I see you. I see all of you, and I appreciate you for who you are and your uniqueness, and each of your even you, Nick, your beauty. But I just think that I think that we have to treat everybody fairly, and but it is important, as Dr. Pinkert said, to understand how there's perhaps generational feelings of mistrust, and that's important for understanding and for helping us do our job in a more effective way.
You know what? What I'll say is I misheard you. You did not say divisive. You said differences. So
Differences.
I perceived and I took in divisive. And so that was my misunderstanding. So you're right.
Yeah. So I would love to know, and this is more of a free play question. It's in a psychological safe space, just you, me, and however many thousands of people watching this. If there's something that you have been curious about that you haven't had an opportunity to ask, that could help you understand something that's really been troubling you, right? And wanted to provide that space to open that up for a question. If you had something that you wanted to pose that we could help you understand, or that the panel could help you understand.
Well, given my psychology background, I guess we can go there. So, and I think it kind of relates to the initial comment that I made. So I feel like at some point, sometimes we may be speaking two different languages, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does.
And
absolutely.
Okay, and trying to find a way to come together to understand that the languages that we speak. And I certainly am not here to offend anybody. That's the last thing I want to do.
No.
And so, when we talk about terminology and the way that we speak to each other and how we interact with each other, I really think that is that initial point of unity, of coming together and growing at that point. And once we recognize that communication, that we can start that footpath to growth, is kind of how I see it. And again, as I educate myself, that's kind of what I've heard as well and can relate to.
Can you give me an example of a terminology where you're not quite sure if it's right or wrong, or something? Maybe an example where you see some communication challenges.
I would go back. The first time I heard white privilege, I had no idea what that was. And it was confusing to me. My gut reaction was, well, that doesn't apply to me, and here I am, the white skinned guy, and so then I took the time to educate myself.
Yeah.
And I have much better perspective today than I did prior. And I think that applies to implicit bias. I think it applies to a lot of different spaces in the conversations that we're having even today. But those are just a couple of examples.
Got it. Thank you for that, Nick. One of the things, if I could shift a bit, is there's the Peace Officers Bill of Rights. And I know it's a very contentious discussion or debate around the transparency and some of the provisions within the Peace Officers Bill of Rights. But I wanted to open up this discussion around where you think it could be improved and where we're seeing it fall short. And I want to get both sides. So Dr. Pinkett, I want to start with you. And Rabia, you can jump in. Rabia, you can jump in. But yeah, where do we go?
Well, I see the Police Officers Bill of Rights sometimes as a way of protecting bad actors who have this shield that you can't do anything to them because they have to have someone, I think if I'm understanding it correctly, they need to have a sworn officer there with them. Only a sworn officer can ask them questions. They don't have to answer questions right away when something has happened. They have a day or two to contemplate coming before someone for an investigation. The records are kept secret. Then they get to look at them before anybody else gets to see them. Certain things that I think aren't afforded the regular public is afforded them, which makes me think, why is it so important that we guard them from the same kinds of things that the public would have to go through without those kind of protections? There's only a certain number that they are to be investigated at a time that is convenient for them or during their shift. You can only talk to them for a certain length of time. You can't talk, like someone who's arrested, they can talk to them all night long up until 3 or 4 in the morning, and they've been there since 8 at night. But you couldn't do that with an officer investigating them. They have the privilege of being comfortable, being a wide awake and available when they're available to have the investigation and questioning. So those are the kinds of things about the Officers' Bill of Rights that troubles me, because it seems like there's so much protection before they even get investigated.
Yeah. Sheriff Abe, anything that Dr. Pinkard brought up that you would contend maybe? And
it may be incorrect. If I'm incorrect, please let me know.
Yeah, you were pretty close to right on there. There's the Peace Officers Bill of Rights are a series of statutes in the government code that govern the handling of police officer misconduct, of records and other things. It's kind of a conflict for me as somebody participating in this panel right now who's interested in convincing you that, hey, we do really thorough investigations of our people. I don't want bad deputy sheriffs policing our communities, working in our jails, representing me out in the community in those dark alleys and those far reaches of the county, right? And if I could just show you the thoroughness of the investigations that we do, I think you would go, oh yeah, it would build trust and engender that confidence that would smash a lot of these feelings of mistrust. So in that sense, I would love to whip out those files and sit down and show you. On the other side, it's one of those things that gives our employees some comfort in knowing that they have some due process protections, that they will not be tried in the media, in the court of public opinion. And I value our employees having that comfort. I think it contributes to the attraction of this as a good place to work as a police officer, deputy sheriff. In other states, we see peace officers being fired at the curbside, when there's allegations of misconduct, or I've heard of sheriffs coming in and being elected and firing the whole department and then hiring all their new buddies. And those things don't happen in California, in large part because of the Peace Officers Bill of Rights. So it's a double-edged sword. And I hope I explained that adequately.
Yeah, no, very helpful. Thank you, Sheriff. And Nick, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so as the association, we advocate for our first line deputies, senior deputies or sergeants, which really are first responders with the sheriff's office, as well as our DA investigators with the DA's office. In the Peace Officer Bill, I encourage everybody to take a look at it. It is in the California Government Code 3300 to 3312. And it lays out, a series of processes that allow for that due process. I think if you read those, and then I agree with the sheriff, if you take the time to see the process in action, if afforded the ability to do so, that you would see that it's not a process that is working to keep bad actors in law enforcement. It is simply a process that allows time and due process so that an accurate investigation is conducted with any allegation against a law enforcement officer with our agency or any agency in California. So in that regard, I don't see it as an issue. I think it's important to also mention that even though we advocate for our members, that I certainly don't have any interest in keeping bad actors in our association. That would do us a huge disservice to the rest of our members who go out each day and work long hours and are committed to protecting the community. So in that regard, I wouldn't want to, think that this is a process to try to keep those individuals around when there's been obvious misconduct or excessive use of force.
Yeah.
May
Well,
I ask a question?
You may, of course.
Okay. How many officers have ever been fired or released?
I certainly
I
don't.
mean,
know the
yeah, I
answer
don't
to that
need
question.
names or anything. Just have we ever?
Oh, without question. We unfortunately fire some every year. I don't have those numbers offhand with me, but they're part of. I believe the disposition is listed on our public-facing
Okay.
statistics related to personnel complaints.
Okay.
But we do terminate employees when
Okay.
they behave badly.
And
Thank
that is
you.
public information.
Right. I have never seen or heard of any, but I certainly will check out the website.
It's usually a fairly quiet process, in part because of the protections that Peace
Right.
Officers Bill of Rights afford. We normally don't trumpet, hey, this
Right.
employee was
I can
fired today.
understand. Right. I can
But
understand.
So
I
that's not
just
going to pop
hope
up on
that,
Facebook. Okay.
yeah, I just hope
Got it.
that those officers that are fired, unfortunately, don't get hired somewhere else. That's the problem. They get fired one place and they can go right next door and get hired in the next law enforcement and do the same thing. Unfortunately.
And I think what's very poignant is that we've been having a really good discussion and dialogue around equality. And the Peace Officers Bill of Rights, just as it's laid out, seems that there's a different process than what the public would encounter in terms of investigations. Can you see where that would be, I guess, maybe a bit, at least a contributor to the distrust of the process? And if so, is there any recourse? I mean, because it is a legislation, it is a legislative code. How would something like that be changed or any oversight or review?
That's true. It is the law, so it wouldn't have to be changed through the legislative process. There's been efforts made, and some changes have been made over time to it. So sort of a gradual repealing or softening of the Peace Officers Bill of Rights. There's other public employee groups that have similar types of protections, firefighters and such, and civil servants in general tend to have some protections as compared to the private sector. So that is a challenge for us as managers and keeping our workforce efficient.
Yeah, got it. Rabia, any thoughts on Peace Officers Bill of Rights?
I do not have anything to add to what was already said. I agree with Dr. I think she did it perfectly, but I know we're short on time, but I think we'd be remiss if we don't take the opportunity to kind of touch on the issues related in surrounding mental health. I think, Nick talking about like his psychology background, but I also want to hear from Sheriff Ayub as well. It's just kind of the concept of ongoing mental health screenings because of the nature of the job and how you incorporate that in therapy and mental health into the law enforcement, oversight, not the right word, but training or
continuous improvement and training. And I'll add on to that because I think you naturally shifted to where I was going to go next, Rabia, was mental health and talking about resources required to appropriately respond to mental health or mental crises in the community, and whether that should be something that your departments should be handling, or should there be resources allocated to mental health professionals in partnership with law enforcement. So, first and foremost, what are we doing to ensure the continuous review and health checks, mental health checks for your departments? And then how do you see mental health crises and resources to responding to crises in the community?
Am I hearing right? You're asking about mental health of our employees?
That's correct.
Maintaining that, and
That's right.
and then how we interact with the mental health consumers in the community.
I'll refine the second one, but yeah. So first and foremost, it's keeping an eye on the mental health of your employees first and foremost.
Mhm. That's a really important thing. I think most everybody knows about the borderline incident that happened late 2018, and that took a toll emotionally, mentally on a lot of our staff. But working in this profession, there can be some cumulative impacts on mental health, right? That's a really important thing for me as the manager to be mindful of. We have an internal employee assistance program that's available to all of our staff. We also have a staff psychologist who not only does the screening for pre-employment review of potential employees, but is also available for consultation. When we have a critical incident, we mandate involve staff to meet with our staff psychologists, and they can't return to work until they've been given a clean bill of health, so to speak. We also have an internal peer support program, and that's a more of an informal program that employees have access to, and that we will integrate into or with employees who have experienced some exceptionally traumatic incidents, or who just seem to need a helping hand, and don't necessarily want to go to the employee assistance program or to the staff psychologist, but they do need some support from some trained folks within our organization. Our Deputy Sheriff's Association, Nick might be able to speak to it, just rolled out an application that's really beneficial for employees to access, and I'll let him speak to that if he may. But and maybe if you want to talk about that real briefly, Nick, and we can go to the second part.
Sure. Yeah. So this is an area of great importance for the association as well. We think it's an area where we can continue to grow and develop, and in part we did roll out with an app, a wellness app that's dedicated to our members, and it was in partnership with the sheriff's office too. We both saw the value in this, and it does connect our first responders to law enforcement specific resources related to mental health. And it also is an education program that educates them on indicators that they may be experiencing, post-traumatic stress injury, and what those indicators may look like, and what to do if you do identify those. And really our goal is to identify them before they become serious issues, so that they can deal with the mental health problems and continue on with their career.
Okay. Excellent. Well, I think the second part of that question was talking about the allocation of resources and what should be on the law enforcement plate versus what shouldn't be. And if we talk about responding to mental health crises, and are law enforcement officers best equipped to handle these kinds of incidents, or should there be an attachment with mental health professionals, right? And if that's not the case, why not now? And what kind of resources or allocations of funding would you like to see to ensure that the right people are handling the right calls before something escalates unnecessarily?
I've heard those conversations about perhaps retooling our public safety to having different types of professionals responding to incidents in the community. We do interact with the mentally ill, be it drug-induced or organic, or a combination of the two, quite frequently in the community. Almost 40% of our inmate population is on psychotropic medications. So we have a significant portion of those that drive crime in our community that suffers from some form of mental illness. So it's something we're very accustomed to dealing with. Our employees, almost all of our deputy sheriffs that police the community have been through crisis intervention team training. That's something we implemented a number of years ago, and have worked hard to get all of our, most of our staff trained up on. We have about about 95% of our patrol force that are trained in these principles. And these involve interacting with people in crisis. We're working on some trauma-informed training that to accompany it as well. De-escalation is a large component of crisis intervention team training. And since we've adapted that training to most of our patrol force, we've seen precipitous declines in citizen complaints, incidents of uses of force, incidents of deputies being hurt because they're using force more infrequently. And a tremendous tool for our police officers in our county are not only the deputy sheriffs, but also the police officers, the other police agencies in the county have the crisis intervention team training. So we've really adapted to this. We also have a program that integrates behavioral health staff with our deputy sheriffs in the community. They work and go out into the community. They're largely centered on the homeless populations. As I think you know, we've seen increases in our homeless populations throughout the county. It's really a nationwide issue, but many of those folks have some severe mental illness. We work and I talked when I first started about being public safety. It's not all about arresting, issuing citations. It's about solving problems. And most of what we do with what we call our vulnerable population deputies, those that are tasked with interacting with the homeless, is try to get resources and assistance to those people. Many are resistant to care being provided to them. But we do find ways to help them out of homelessness and solve those problems. So we currently have cooperative arrangements with behavioral health. I'd like to see more of it for sure. I worry about a different type of public safety person responding to calls like this because they can be really unpredictable and volatile. I fear we would just end up having a different category of police officer in the community when we have good people already that we can continue to train, continue to have them look for resources and ways to prevent crime and keep people out of jail. We don't need jail filled with mentally ill people.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a partnership, right? It's you want the right people handling the right situations. Just calling attention to time. We are over time. However, what I wanted to do with this last bit of time is open the floor for the conversation around reform. I want to start with Rabia and maybe end with Dr. Pinkard. If there's any reform discussions or topics that you'd like to see addressed, and maybe this carries over into our next discussion should we have one. But I'd like to open up the floor and sort of end on that note. Rabia.
Yeah, sure. So what I will say is that Black lawyers of Ventura County have met with Sheriff Ayub, and we will be meeting with Nick. And so we're going to keep those conversations offline right now with our proposals so that we can work together to collaborate on how to, hopefully move them forward and come to a mutual, agreement, understanding of something that could work for the community at large. But I did have, some additional thoughts on things that could bring to light perhaps issues that are currently not being addressed. And one thing I think is the concept of data and how data is collected and what data is collected. And so I'd be curious to know if there's some kind of mechanism in place, or if there's some kind of collaborations with the local universities and law enforcement to understand who's being arrested based off of initial contacts, right? And so if there's demographic data for initial contacts, moving on to who are being actually arrested, and then kind of corresponding to who's then being charged, and then who is being sentenced. I think a part of the reasons why we the need for perhaps a closer look at Ventura County and our relationship with law enforcement in the community is because we don't have the data to demonstrate whether or not there is an issue. Because perhaps maybe we are just chasing our tails and maybe there isn't an issue, right? And but to the extent that we don't know, I think that level of not being sure, I think is a little unsettling to the community members. So to the extent that we can have a better data collection system to it, we can determine whether or not there is in fact a problem and then respond accordingly. So that's one thought. And also going back to the concept of who is investigating excessive use of force and any allegations of police brutality, not resorting back to the civilian oversight committee or I'm looking at the DA's office, right? Is there an inherent conflict of interest between the district attorney's office actually being the ones charged with investigating the underlying crime that's being alleged to have occurred, and the officer who has been alleged to have committed some form of excessive use of force? So perhaps there is a competing interest that might be better served if it is an outside investigator to come in to look at the excessive use of force element, as opposed to the district attorney's office, who is looking at the underlying crime and then the use of force, because you are then relying on the testimony of that officer that you are charged with investigating. I think that is perhaps an inherent conflict of interest that provides a level of dis-ease and discomfort that these allegations, that these complaints of excessive use of force perhaps are not being adequately represented. And I don't know if that's an appropriate question for law enforcement. That might be a question for the district attorney's office, but I'd be curious to know your thoughts on having an outside, whether it's attorney general's office or someone else coming in to investigate allegations of excessive use of force, so that that inherent conflict of interest can be removed.
Sure, I'd be happy to take that. I know there is currently a legislative effort to require the Attorney General to investigate officer-involved shootings. And so that's something that is being considered at the state level. I don't, the use of force investigations are typically conducted by the agency, unless there's some type of conflict within the agency, and then it will be farmed out to an independent investigation team. I've seen private investigations conducted in some of these cases. But I've also seen federal agencies brought in to investigate cases where there's some sort of evidence of cover-up or misdeeds, or something that really points to mistrust in the process. There's a good deal of independence between local law enforcement and the district attorney's office. I understand the sort of symbiotic relationship between prosecuting crime and the police bring the crime to the DA, the prosecution takes place. There's interviews with peace officers by district attorneys, and there's also peace officers that work for the district attorney's office. So, but I do know locally there's a great deal of professionalism. I don't feel I have any sway over the district attorney. He's very morally straight and very upright in terms of his discharge of his responsibilities. But I understand, I get the perception, and I think it is important that we have trust in the community.
Any final thoughts, I guess, or in terms of reforms, Dr. Pinker, that you wanted to touch on before we close out?
You're on mute.
Yeah. Good call.
Okay, thank you.
There you are. Sure.
I would just like to see more use of other agencies, just like the sheriff has said with the mentally ill, the behavioral board I was on that for a couple of years. And I know that they work closely with the sheriff department on calls that involve the mentally ill. But I think sometimes when we say reform, everybody wants to scream, we're going to take all the money from the police and we won't be protected. But I think there are times when other agencies in the county can be used to do some of the things that we now task our law enforcement to do, so that it will relieve them so that they could do what they were trained to do, which is to protect us from the criminals that are out there. So I think that when we look at some of the things that we have them do, and one of the things that was mentioned earlier about a resource officer in the schools, I don't think that we need a resource officer in a school. I think that a lot of times the resource officers in the school, they have been known to put things in a young person's CUME file. They noticed that they had a red sash or some kind of handkerchief, and they put down there, it looks like it's gang paraphernalia. And then when they do get into some kind of altercation, they get a gang enhancement if they ever go to the courts. So I think what we need in the schools is someone who is tasked as a counselor to work with young people who may have issues on the campus, because there are counselors who can float and be the friend and the guidance counselor for those students who seem to have issues. We don't need a police car at the school all the time. It's like it's a police state a lot of times. You know, you're at school and there's a police car, what's going on? So I think that one of the things we could do is not have police officers on the campus. We could do with a psychologist, a guidance counselor who floats to take care of some of those issues, so that students won't be thinking that they're always going to be arrested or written up for something that they may do on campus that may not have the same effect as if an officer put it in their folder. So I don't think that the reform is bad. I think it's good to think about some things that could change, like chokeholds, a knee on someone's neck, a no-knock warrants. Those are reforms that make sense. So for us to be afraid of the reform, I don't think we're taking away a lot of the protections from the officers when we ask for those things. I think it's just another way of confronting some problems that may come up that will not end in disaster like someone's death.
Thank you for that, Dr. Pinker. With that stated, I think we've reached a point in the conversation where we should wrap. I want to thank all of the guests this evening, Sheriff Ayub, President Nick Odeneth, Dr. Irene Pinkard, and Rabia Rahman. It has been an absolutely riveting conversation. I think we dug into some topics that the community had questions on and wanted us to dig further into. I hope that it's provided further insight and perspective from both sides. And I hope that we can continue this dialogue even offline and work together in partnership to bring some change and some understanding.
I'm looking forward to that.
Indeed. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Wishing you all stay safe, stay well.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You as well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.